We're now seeing a resurgence of infections, not only in Hong Kong, but also in the mainland. How does this affect your view of a recovery next year?
Well, undoubtedly, the fact that the pandemic is coming back in new waves in various parts of the world is a challenge. But I think next year is some way off, and I remain hopeful that even during the course of this year, as travel restrictions are gradually lessened where the pandemic permits, we will begin to see a return to luxury travel. But it's not going to be until next year that we really start to see volumes returning to a greater extent.
In the meantime, then, where are your hotel occupancy rates, both in Hong Kong and what's happening in the mainland?
Yes, in Hong Kong, they're clearly very modest, reflecting the fact that there is an absolute travel ban out of and into Hong Kong, which restricts both business and tourist visitors coming here. But in the mainland, I think it's a good indication of the degree to which travel can bounce back. We've seen occupancies in the 80s and 90s in 2 or 3 of our hotels in the mainland. And I'm confident that in the absence of new waves of the pandemic there, that can continue.
How concerned are you that the political situation in Hong Kong will continue even after the coronavirus travel restrictions are lifted, that aspect will continue to keep both leisure as well as business travellers away?
Hong Kong's clearly experiencing a challenging time at the moment, but it's not my place to talk on politics. What I can say is that I'm very confident that the people of Hong Kong will see their way through these challenges, and I'm optimistic about the outlook both from a business and a travel perspective and a tourist perspective of Hong Kong in the decades to come.
So I understand that the group is still going ahead with the opening of half a dozen new hotels across Europe, across Asia as well. Talk me through the logic of going through with this, and do you expect there to be demand for that? And does that demand come from, I guess, markets that are similar to China, where there's going to be strong domestic demand that will tide you over while international travel is still pretty on a nascent recovery path?
Yes, I think we've seen Guangdong, Pudong, in Beijing, the volumes return. We've seen in our luxury resorts in the Mediterranean, in areas of Bodrum and in Como, extremely high levels of occupancy in the last few weeks. And as we've reopened hotels in Europe, we've begun to see occupancy come back. So I do take the view that when we get into a post-COVID era, whenever that may be, and I'm hopeful it'll be sometime during the course of next year, we will see particularly luxury leisure travel come back. And it's for that reason that I remain confident in the new openings that we have got planned. Business travel will also bounce back, but perhaps not as quickly and not to the same extent. In the first half, we did announce a new property in Vienna, and in the coming months, I'm looking forward to opening properties in Madrid, where the Mandarin Oriental Ritz is being restored at present. We have new properties coming through in Lucerne and in Istanbul on the Bosphorus. And for all of those locations, I do feel very confident that we will see business coming back in 2021, assuming, of course, that the issues of the pandemic do progressively get managed.
In the meantime, what are you doing in terms of cost cutting?
We've gone through a couple of rounds of cost cuts to control our corporate costs, and we've taken extensive measures in all of our properties in order to reduce the payroll levels. But our colleagues have been wonderful in terms of the degree to which they've engaged with us and worked with us to bring down costs, to help us manage both the payroll costs and also the broader costs of the properties, to ensure that we can manage the cost burn through this very difficult period. And looking forward, I believe we've now brought the costs down to a level which we can manage with the extensive cash resources and committed debt facilities we have to see our way through to a time when we can return to profitability. The key, I think, is managing costs, and I'm very glad to say the commitment of colleagues working with us to enable us to see our way through to a better time.
So will that be more management projects rather than outright ownership to try and get to more of an asset-light model?
Yes, or we have 22 projects under development across the globe, in the Americas, in places like Hawaii and Dallas. In Europe, I've mentioned Lucerne, reopening Madrid, a new property in London, Moscow, and others. All of those new projects are management contracts. So whilst we will continue to own the properties that we do, the proportion of the group's assets that are managed will progressively increase.
James, you talked about that quick rebound that you saw in China when cases declined. Where are you expecting to see such a trend in the future around the world?
Well, I think the key, I mentioned Bodrum and Como as two examples in resort locations where I think the underlying desire of the consumer to travel remains. And once the constraints on them doing so loosen, I'm sure that the consumers will come back. So I think it will first of all come back in resort and leisure destinations, and then secondly in city locations where there is a leisure element. I do think that business travel will probably be the slowest to adjust and come back, simply because we have adapted to a new norm in terms of our business means of operation. And I think, therefore, people will feel less inclined to come back to travel quite as rapidly from a business perspective. But when I look across our portfolio of properties in Southeast Asia, Singapore, Bangkok, in locations around Europe, and indeed in parts of the Americas, like Miami, I think that once the issues of the pandemic are managed, we will start to see that leisure travel come back very quickly.
James, there's been some concern that one of the worst case scenarios for hotels, F&B leisure is this idea that this is going to be a seasonal thing that keeps coming back, and that an element of social distancing and travel restrictions will need to stay in place. What's the kind of worst case scenario you're looking at in terms of permanent changes to the whole industry?
Well, I think clearly that the continuation of the pandemic is a challenge, but we have adapted the way our properties operate as we've reopened them to ensure that the highest standards of hygiene and health are in place, and that We Care, our programme looking after both colleagues and guests, ensures that people can travel to our properties safely. The way we've actually been able to adjust our restaurants for social distancing, and indeed the flows through the hotels, I think gives us confidence in that respect. And I have to believe that we will progressively adapt to the conditions of the pandemic. So I think the long-term issue will not be the COVID virus itself, but us all adjusting to a greater awareness of health and hygiene conditions and adjusting our lifestyles accordingly. And I'm very confident in that respect that the Mandarin Oriental brand and positioning as a luxury property will be able to take advantage of that, and people will return to our properties with confidence.